The ocean is calm. Too calm. A blue horizon stretches endlessly, hiding death beneath its glassy skin. Then, engines roar. Black silhouettes slash across the sky. Bombers dive. Torpedoes glide. The Pacific erupts. It is June 1942. The world holds its breath. 4 Japanese carriers, the pride of the Imperial Navy, advance like armored giants across the sea. They have crushed every fleet in their path. Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, Singapore. The rising sun seems unstoppable. But now, they are being hunted. From a tiny speck of coral in the middle of the Pacific, a desperate American gamble unfolds. Midway, an atoll barely large enough to hold an airstrip. Yet here, the fate of the Pacific War will be decided. American codebreakers have cracked Japan's secrets. A trap is set, but victory is not guaranteed. The U.S. Navy is battered, outnumbered, scarred by Pearl Harbor. Every move is a razor's edge between triumph and annihilation. Men strap themselves into cockpits, knowing the odds. Knowing many will not return. Engines ignite. Wings rise. The sky fills with fire. The Battle of Midway has begun, and the tide of World War II is about to turn. History remembers battles not just for the clash of steel and fire, but for the moment when destiny itself hangs in the balance. The Battle of Midway was one of those rare collisions, an encounter where entire empires trembled and the outcome of a world war shifted in a matter of hours. In June 1942, the Pacific Ocean was a vast graveyard. 6 months earlier, Japan had struck like lightning at Pearl Harbor, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet. Battleships smoldered in the harbor. American pride lay in ashes. The rising sun surged across Asia and the Pacific, capturing territories with a speed that stunned the world. From Malaya to the Philippines, from Guam to Wake Island, the Japanese Empire seemed invincible. And yet, in the shadows, a counterstroke was forming. American cryptographers at Pearl Harbor had broken Japan's secret naval codes. They discovered a target, known only as AF. It was Midway Atoll, a lonely ring of sand and coral perched in the central Pacific. Whoever controlled Midway would control the ocean routes. For Japan, it was the final step to force the United States into negotiation. For America, losing it would mean the Pacific falling into enemy hands. The stakes were unimaginable, but the balance of power was lopsided. Japan entered the fight with 4 carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, floating fortresses that had shattered Pearl Harbor. Their pilots were veterans, honed by years of conquest. The Americans, by contrast, had only 3, Enterprise, Hornet, and the hastily repaired Yorktown. Their crews were green. Their planes, often outdated. Their odds? Desperate. Yet desperation can ignite miracles. From the control rooms of naval intelligence to the wooden decks of carriers, from the blistering cockpits of dive bombers to the terrified soldiers stationed on Midway itself, every man felt the weight of history pressing down. There would be no retreat, no safe harbor, no second chance. The Pacific had become a chessboard, and every piece was in motion. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, the mastermind of Pearl Harbor, sought a decisive blow. Admiral Chester Nimitz, calm and calculating, prepared his trap with icy precision. Each believed victory was within reach. Both could not be right. In just 3 days of brutal combat, luck, courage, and sacrifice would weave together a story so improbable it feels less like strategy and more like fate. Entire squadrons would vanish into the sea. Carriers would explode in towering infernos. Decisions made in seconds would determine the outcome of decades. Midway was not just a battle. It was the moment the hunter became the hunted. It was the fulcrum on which the Pacific War turned. And it began with silence, with the endless blue, and with the calm before the storm. The morning of December 7th, 1941, still hung in the minds of every sailor, every pilot, every commander of the United States Navy. A morning that had begun with the smell of breakfast drifting across Battleship Row. A morning of easy routines, Sunday quiet, and unsuspecting calm. Then came the scream of aircraft. Engines howling like predators. bombs whistling as they fell. Explosions ripped through the harbor like thunder rolling across steel. Pearl Harbor burned. The Arizona was torn apart in an instant, her hull splitting, her magazines erupting in a pillar of smoke and flame that clawed at the sky. Men were incinerated where they stood. Others leapt into the oil-slick water, their uniforms catching fire as the harbor itself became an inferno. The Oklahoma rolled over, capsizing with hundreds trapped inside. Their pounding fists against steel echoed long after the bombs stopped falling. The Nevada, desperate to escape, was beached, her decks shredded, her crew dead and wounded scattered across steel. In less than 2 hours, the Pacific Fleet was crippled. Battleships, symbols of American power, lay in ruins. Hundreds of planes were destroyed on the ground, burnt to twisted skeletons of metal. More than 2,000 Americans were dead. The rising sun had struck with surgical precision. The Imperial Japanese Navy seemed untouchable. To Americans, the war had come not as a declaration, but as a dagger in the dark. From Tokyo, the architects of the strike celebrated. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, though somber in victory, had achieved what many thought impossible. He had humbled a giant. The U.S. Pacific Fleet was on its knees. But the attack was not absolute. In the smoking wreckage of Pearl Harbor, 3 American aircraft carriers were absent. By sheer coincidence or providence, they had been away at sea. Enterprise, Lexington, Saratoga. They survived. And those floating airfields would soon become the weapons of salvation. Yet in those early days, hope was fragile. The Japanese tide swept unchecked across the Pacific. Guam fell. Wake Island fell. The Philippines bled under siege. The rising sun planted its flag on every shore it touched. To soldiers and civilians alike, Japan seemed unstoppable. For America, Pearl Harbor was not just a defeat, it was a wound, raw and open, that demanded retribution. Across the nation, young men lined up to enlist, their anger forged into resolve. Factories roared to life, churning out planes, ships, and weapons at a pace no empire could match. Still, revenge would not come quickly. The Navy, crippled and reeling, fought desperate holding actions. The Battle of the Coral Sea in May 1942 was the first check on Japan's advance, but even that clash ended in stalemate. America had slowed the tide, but not turned it. Pearl Harbor lingered like a ghost. Every strategy meeting, every battle plan, every whispered prayer carried the memory of that day. The men who would sail into Midway carried the ashes of the harbor with them. They carried the memory of comrades drowned, burned, entombed in steel. And as they prepared to face the Japanese again, one question burned brighter than the flames that had consumed Arizona's hull. Could America strike back? The answer would come, not in the calm waters of Hawaii, but on a lonely speck of coral 1,000 miles away. Midway, where vengeance and destiny would meet. From the flames of Pearl Harbor, Japan emerged triumphant, an empire in full stride, its war machine sweeping across the Pacific like a tidal wave. The rising sun blazed high, and every nation in its path seemed powerless to resist. The Imperial Japanese Navy was the most feared on Earth. Its carrier strike groups, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, Shokaku, Zuikaku, were the sharpest blades ever wielded upon the sea. At Pearl Harbor, they had proven their reach. Now they would prove their dominance. One by one, the dominoes fell. Hong Kong collapsed within weeks. The Philippines, long defended by American and Filipino troops, suffered months of agony before Bataan and Corregidor surrendered in 1942. Thousands were marched to their deaths in the blazing sun, the infamous Bataan Death March carving a scar into history. To the south, Malaya crumbled. Singapore, the Gibraltar of the East, surrendered, shocking Britain and the world. In a single stroke, Japan had shattered Western prestige in Asia. In Burma, in the Dutch East Indies, Japanese troops advanced relentlessly, seizing oil, rubber, and tin to fuel their conquests. Every victory swelled the empire's might. The ocean itself seemed to belong to Japan. Battleships escorted transports laden with supplies. Carrier planes dominated the skies. The rising sun flag flew over island after island, fortress after fortress. By early 1942, the Japanese Empire stretched across an area larger than Hitler's Third Reich. At its heart was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, brilliant, calculating, burdened by a single truth. He had unleashed a storm, but he knew its fury could not last. "I fear," he had warned, "that we have awakened a sleeping giant." Still, until that giant rose to its full height, Japan would strike, and strike hard. The victories intoxicated Tokyo. The people believed in an unstoppable destiny, an empire carved across the Pacific, secured by fire and steel. Propaganda trumpeted triumph. Soldiers were hailed as divine instruments of the emperor's will. But beneath the triumph lay shadows. The war machine was stretched thin, its supply lines long, its enemies many. To truly break America's back, Japan needed one more decisive blow. A strike so crushing that the United States would be forced to negotiate peace. That strike would come at a place called Midway. To Japan's leaders, Midway was more than an atoll. It was the forward door to Hawaii, the shield against American counterattack, the stepping stone to dominance of the Pacific. If Midway fell, Pearl Harbor itself would stand exposed. If Midway fell, Japan could consolidate its empire unchallenged. But the Japanese high command underestimated the resilience of the very enemy they had bloodied. They saw a crippled fleet. They saw a shaken nation. What they could not see, was that behind the ruins of Pearl Harbor, the United States was preparing to strike back. The rising sun was at its zenith. The empire's borders stretched wide, its navy supreme, its armies undefeated. Yet history's cruel irony is this. The moment of greatest triumph is often the moment just before the fall. And as Japan sailed proudly across the Pacific, convinced of destiny, convinced of victory, the ocean itself was conspiring against them. In codebooks, in cipher rooms, in whispers of intelligence that would turn triumph into disaster. For though the sun blazed high, it was already beginning to set. Down in the basement, the war sounded different. No guns. No sirens. Just pencils scratching, fans humming, and the relentless clatter of typewriters turning secrets into sound. Pearl Harbor's wounds were still fresh upstairs. Downstairs, a new kind of weapon was being forged, silence sharpened into insight. They called it JN-25. A fortress of numbers guarded by more numbers, a code inside a code, wrapped in additives that slid like ice across meaning. Messages arrived as strings of 5-digit groups, bland as gravel, deadly as torpedoes. Break one piece, and the rest reshaped itself. Break two, and Tokyo shifted the ground again. It was supposed to be uncrackable. Inside Station HYPO, Commander Joseph Rockefort ruled the maze. He wore fatigue like a second skin and irony like armor. Coffee cooled beside ashtrays crowded with stubs. Maps papered the walls. Strings traced routes of ships no one could see. Every morning began with the same ritual. Gather intercepts, build dreams out of fragments, then smash those dreams against arithmetic until something true remained. Language became terrain. A destroyer's shadow had a statistical shape. A convoy's breath left patterns and schedules. Routine created fingerprints. Even the Japanese talent for deception could not hide its heartbeat. HYPO listened to that pulse night after night and began to hear a pattern under the noise. Edwin Layton fed the work with context, a steady mind connecting clues to commanders and ships to doctrine. Radiomen at sea vacuumed the air, dragging in sparks of traffic from storm and sky. Cryptanalysts bled those sparks dry. Each 5-digit group became a suspect. Each index card a trench line. Hours blurred. Days fused. The only clock that mattered was the enemy's. They chased repeats. They hunted cribs. They courted math like a dangerous lover, sweet one moment, murderous the next. IBM punch cards bit their fingertips. Tabulators groaned like tired beasts. But the decisive strokes were human. Tenacity, hunch, and the refusal to accept a wall as final. JN-25 wasn't just a cipher. It was a culture, abbreviations, habits, operational rhythms. When carriers sailed, the air itself changed. Traffic swelled. Call signs shifted. Weather reports multiplied along routes like breadcrumbs. HYPO collected them and found a path. Then came a tremor. Increased traffic. Words that felt heavy even without translation. References to a strike force. To a target labeled only as AF. The letters meant nothing by themselves, but in the language of war, they rang like an alarm bell in a dark room. Rockefeller's team argued the contours of meaning. Aleutians? Hawaii? Some far-flung base? The Japanese had camouflage in their codes and camouflage in their plans. The analysts pulled at threads and the tapestry wrinkled, then smoothed, then wrinkled again. Patterns emerged, then vanished. Certainty hovered just beyond reach. Dead ends mounted. Sleep thinned. Tempers cracked like ice. Yet the arithmetic kept whispering the same uneasy promise. A carrier strike was coming, focused, ambitious, meant to finish what Pearl Harbor began. It would land like a hammer on one small point of the American map. They needed a name for that point. They needed proof bold enough to move fleets. Nimitz listened. He did not flinch at ambiguity. He demanded edges, timings, tonnage, direction. He asked the only question that mattered. When? HYPO stared back into the sea of digits. Partial breaks gave bearings. A rebuilt super-enciphered group suggested a rendezvous window. Oilers and escorts implied distance. The math began to narrow the horizon. The target was out there. The net tightened. But a hunter with the wrong coordinates is a blind predator. One guess, and men would die for smoke. The codebreakers needed a spark to set certainty ablaze. Whispers circled a simple, dangerous idea. A ruse. A message sent into the dark, crafted as bait, designed to echo back through the enemy's own cipher. If HYPO was right, the echo would name AF. The plan would risk exposure. It would antagonize skeptics. It might fail. But wars do not bow to caution. They bend to courage and proof. The room fell still. The trap was about to move from numbers to nerve. The stakes could not be higher. The riddle of AF gnawed at every mind inside station HYPO. Without a name, the enemy's plan was fogged, dangerous, shapeless, impossible to strike. Rockefeller and his team circled it like wolves, but still it refused to reveal itself. Then came the gambit. On Midway Atoll, engineers opened the radio lines and sent a message in plain English, stripped of encryption, knowing the Japanese were listening. The transmission was simple. Midway's water distillation plant had broken down. Fresh water was running low. It was bait. Hours later, HYPO's intercept stations picked up a Japanese transmission. Encoded, yes, but within its layers was the smoking gun. AF, the message reported, was short of water. There it was. Proof carved in numbers and static. AF was Midway. For Nimitz, the revelation was lightning in the dark. The Japanese were not striking at Hawaii, not the Aleutians, not San Diego. They were coming for the atoll. The giant had revealed its target. Now the hunter could take his place. Still, the weight of the gamble pressed hard. Japan would arrive with overwhelming force. For carriers, battleships, cruisers, destroyers, an armada built to annihilate. America would stand with 3 carriers, one barely repaired from Coral Sea, and a handful of supporting ships. On paper, the equation screamed disaster. But war is not fought on paper. War thrives in shadows, in timing, in deception. And now, deception was America's ally. Admiral Chester Nimitz moved quickly. Calm, calculating, his voice rarely rose above a measured tone, but behind it was steel. He ordered Task Force 16, Enterprise and Hornet, back to Pearl Harbor. Yorktown, bleeding from Coral Sea, was patched in just 3 days, her wounds hidden beneath fresh paint and welded steel. She would fight again, though many doubted she could survive another battle. Nimitz now held his pieces. He knew when Japan would come. He knew where Japan would strike. It was not enough to ensure victory, but it was enough to prepare a trap. The Pacific became a chessboard, and Nimitz made his move. The American carriers would lie in wait northeast of Midway, hidden beyond the horizon. Midway itself would be the lure, its garrison the bait. And while fleets prepared in silence, the men of Midway braced for annihilation. Marines dug gun pits into the sand. Anti-aircraft crews scanned the endless blue. Pilots strapped themselves into battered planes, knowing they would be outnumbered, outgunned, and very likely outlived. They were pawns in a larger game, yet pawns who knew their sacrifice could change the tide of war. In Tokyo, Yamamoto and his admirals marched confidently toward destiny, unaware the veil had been pierced. They believed surprise was theirs. They believed AF was blind and unguarded. They believed wrong. Because in the silence of Station HYPO, in the smoke-filled rooms where men bent over fragments of digits, the battle had already begun. The Japanese fleet was moving. The Americans were waiting. And the Pacific was holding its breath. War rewards boldness, but only when tempered with nerve. Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, was not a man of theatrics. He was steady, calm, his voice more often measured than loud. Yet beneath that calm ran a streak of steel, the kind of steel forged in disaster, hardened by necessity. In May 1942, the Pacific was still bleeding. Pearl Harbor's scars were raw. The Battle of the Coral Sea had cost dearly. Lexington sunk, Yorktown battered. Japan still stretched its empire unbroken across Asia and the Pacific. On paper, the Americans were cornered. Outnumbered, outgunned, seemingly outmatched. But Nimitz had an advantage the enemy did not know he possessed. Codebreakers had shown him Japan's hand. He knew the target. He knew the date. And he knew that in war, foreknowledge is worth fleets. Still, the gamble was staggering. Nimitz had 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the crippled Yorktown. Japan was coming with 4. Each of theirs carried veteran pilots honed by years of conquest. Many of America's pilots were young, green, some barely familiar with combat. Their planes, Devastators, Wildcats, Dauntless, were often slower, less maneuverable, fragile against the deadly zero. But Nimitz trusted something more than numbers. He trusted resolve. He trusted luck. And he trusted that Japan's overconfidence would become its undoing. His plan was audacious. Instead of defending Pearl Harbor, instead of pulling back, he would spring the trap at Midway. The island's small garrison would brace for the first blow. Behind them, hidden to the northeast, the carriers would lie in wait, engines silent, decks bristling with aircraft, ready to strike the moment Japan revealed itself. The key was timing. Too early, and the carriers risked discovery and destruction. Too late, and Midway would fall, the island's airfields wiped from existence. The window of advantage was razor-thin. Yorktown's condition only deepened the risk. At Coral Sea, she had been ripped open by bombs and torpedoes, her decks scarred, her systems crippled. Normally, repairs of that magnitude would take months. Nimitz gave the shipyard 3 days. Crews worked without pause, patching wounds with steel and willpower. Welders' sparks lit the night. Painters covered scars with fresh coats. Pipes were rerouted, engines coaxed back to life. When she sailed again, Yorktown carried not just steel, but defiance. Her very presence was a bluff, a dare to fate itself. One more battle, one more chance. For Nimitz, this was not just about saving Midway. It was about the Pacific itself. Lose here, and Hawaii would stand exposed. Lose here, and America's ability to project power across the ocean would crumble. Win here, and the tide of the war could shift. He studied his charts, his eyes steady, his hand firm. Every decision was weighted with thousands of lives, with the future of nations. He did not indulge in drama. He simply prepared. In Tokyo, Yamamoto moved confidently, believing the Americans broken, believing Midway an easy kill. He could not imagine that his opponent already held the script of the battle to come. The board was set. The trap was primed. All that remained was to wait, for the thunder of engines, for the scream of bombs, for the clash that would decide the Pacific. And as the sun sank over Pearl Harbor, sailors whispered the same thought, the same prayer, again and again. Let this be the day we strike back. Midway, a dot on the map. 2 ragged islands of coral, and sand adrift in the endless blue. To most of the world, it was nothing, an atoll forgotten by time, battered by surf and seabirds. But in June 1942, it became the center of the universe. The atoll itself was humble. Sand dunes, scraggly vegetation, rusting equipment left to the salt air. Yet it had one thing that mattered more than all else: an airfield. A flat stretch of earth carved into a runway long enough to host squadrons of bombers and fighters. Midway was not just a speck of land. It was a dagger handle sticking out of the Pacific, and whoever gripped it would command the ocean's throat. The U.S. Marines stationed there knew what was coming. They dug trenches into the sand, rolled barrels of fuel into makeshift shelters, and waited under the pitiless sun. Their guns were outdated, their defenses thin, but their orders were clear: hold, fight, resist, whatever it took. Pilots rotated in and out of the island, some veterans, many rookies. They trained in battered aircraft patched with spare parts. Wildcats and buffaloes, slow and clumsy compared to Japan's deadly Zeros. Torpedo bombers that waddled like ducks over the waves, their speed barely enough to outrun their own shadows. And yet those pilots strapped themselves in, adjusted their goggles, and prepared to fly into a storm they might never return from. Life on Midway was a strange balance of monotony and dread. Soldiers wrote letters home in the evening, talking about the heat, the food, the sea. They joked about the smell of bird droppings that clung to everything. But under the laughter was tension, a constant hum in the air. They knew the Japanese were coming. They just didn't know when. Across the island, anti-aircraft guns pointed skyward like nervous fingers. Sandbags piled around command posts. Radio operators sat with headphones pressed tight, scanning for signals in the static. The horizon stretched forever, each wave a question, each cloud a possible threat. Admiral Nimitz had promised reinforcements, and indeed they were coming. Enterprise, Hornet, Yorktown, 3 carriers, hidden far to the northeast. But to the men on Midway, those ships were ghosts on the horizon. Their faith lay not in what they could see, but in what they were told, that help would be there when the hammer fell. The Japanese believed Midway would crumble in days. They expected fear, confusion, surrender. What they would find instead was defiance. Defiance written in trenches. Defiance in the grease-stained hands of mechanics patching bullet holes. Defiance in pilots rehearsing takeoffs on runways so short they seemed suicidal. The atoll waited. Silent. Patient. Every palm tree, every bunker, every stretch of sand became a pawn in the vast game unfolding across the Pacific. And then, across the horizon, came movement. Japanese scouts, carriers, battleships, destroyers, a storm massing unseen. The stage was set, the curtain about to rise, and Midway stood ready to play its part. The Pacific was vast, but the Japanese moved across it like masters of the sea. In late May 1942, Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto's grand design was in motion. It was an armada unlike anything the world had ever seen. 4 fleet carriers at its core: Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, each packed with squadrons of lethal aircraft. Around them swarmed battleships, cruisers, destroyers, submarines, and transports. A spear of steel and fire stretching over miles of ocean. From Tokyo, the plan looked flawless. The Americans had been humbled at Pearl Harbor. Their fleet, Yamamoto believed, was battered and hesitant. Midway would be the bait, the trap that would lure the remnants of the U.S. Navy into open water, where Japan's superior strength would crush them once and for all. To mask their true intentions, a diversionary strike was launched north, toward the Aleutian Islands of Alaska. There, Japanese forces moved to bomb and invade, hoping to split American defenses and sow confusion. To Yamamoto, it was a masterpiece of deception, layers upon layers, drawing the Americans away from the real target. The carriers advanced with discipline. Deck crews worked tirelessly under the rising sun, checking fuel lines, arming torpedoes, securing bombs. Pilots studied their maps, sharpened their focus, rehearsed attack runs in their minds. They were veterans, many of them survivors of Pearl Harbor, men who had flown through fire and returned to tell it. Confidence radiated from them. The Empire had not tasted defeat. Why should this battle be any different? At sea, the fleets moved like floating cities. Engines throbbed beneath decks, sailors manned guns, officers scanned horizons with binoculars. The air smelled of oil, salt, and sweat. Morale was high, and why not? Every Japanese victory thus far had been swift, decisive, absolute. But Yamamoto himself was cautious. He had studied in America, understood its vast industrial power. He knew this war could not drag on forever. His aim was to end it quickly, to break America's will before its factories turned the tide. Midway, he believed, would be the killing blow. The plan relied on surprise. Without it, the scales might tilt. But Yamamoto did not know that surprise was already lost. His enemy was not blind. Nimitz had deciphered his intentions, positioned his own carriers in silence, and was waiting. Yet as the Japanese fleet advanced, the Pacific seemed theirs. Waves parted before them. The wind carried their banners high. The men on deck laughed, smoked, and shared quiet boasts of victories still to come. In their minds, the Americans would soon be finished. In reality, they were sailing into a snare. The Pacific stretched endless and silent. For days, the ocean seemed empty, nothing but wind and water. Yet both fleets were there, crawling toward each other across the horizon, blind hunters circling in the dark. For the Japanese, confidence was absolute. Their 4 carriers were the pride of the empire. Their doctrine was perfected: launch overwhelming strikes, cripple the enemy before he can strike back. It had worked at Pearl Harbor. It had worked at the Coral Sea. They believed it would work again. But Admiral Nimitz's gamble was already bending reality. Northeast of Midway, his 3 carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the battered Yorktown, slipped quietly into position. They kept their radios silent. Their decks bristled with dauntless dive bombers, torpedo planes, and wildcats. Their crews spoke in hushed tones, acutely aware that one mistake, one intercepted signal, could expose everything. The men knew what they faced. Japan's Zero fighters could outturn, outrun, and outclimb almost every American plane. Their pilots were veterans of years of conquest, many with kill counts that seemed impossible. Against them, American squadrons carried outdated devastators and rookies barely blooded. The odds loomed like storm clouds. Still, there was hope. Midway itself had teeth. Army bombers, Marine fighters, Navy patrols, all stationed on the Coral airstrip. Their mission: absorb the first blow, bleed the enemy, and buy time for the carriers lying in wait. Every pilot on Midway knew survival was unlikely. Yet none turned away. Scouts became the eyes of fate. From both sides, long-range patrol planes fanned across the sky, searching for shadows against the sea. The Japanese launched Kawanishi flying boats. The Americans sent out PBY Catalinas, lumbering, vulnerable, yet essential. Each crew knew their discovery could decide the battle. Each mile flown tightened the noose. On June 3rd, a Catalina spotted movement, ships, distant southeast of Midway. The call crackled over the radio. The Japanese were coming. Engines roared on the island as bombers readied for takeoff. Marines raced to their guns. Commanders braced for impact. For Yamamoto's fleet, the illusion of surprise still held. For Nimitz's fleet, the trap was nearly sprung. The horizon grew heavy with tension. Men slept lightly, if at all, clutching letters, cleaning weapons, staring into the night sky where stars glittered like distant tracer fire. They knew dawn would bring fire. The shadow of battle loomed, unseen but undeniable. And with the rising sun, the Pacific would ignite. Dawn broke over Midway on June 4th, 1942. The sun rose like a blade, cutting through mist and cloud, painting the ocean in hues of gold. For a heartbeat, the atoll looked peaceful, gulls wheeling overhead, waves breaking softly against coral. Then came the thunder. Engines roared across the sky. Japanese carrier planes, dozens of them, swarmed over the horizon like a living storm. Dive bombers, torpedo bombers, fighters darting like sharks. The rising sun painted on their wings glowed crimson against the morning light. The alarm blared across Midway. Marines scrambled to their gun pits. Anti-aircraft batteries snapped awake, barrels swinging upward. Pilots rushed to their cockpits, dust swirling across the strip as engines coughed to life. The defenders had known this moment would come, but no amount of preparation could blunt the terror of the sky filled with death. Bombs began to fall. The first detonations ripped craters into the runway, flinging sand and steel into the air. Flames licked across hangars, fueling smoke columns that twisted into the clouds. Anti-aircraft guns answered, tracers clawing at the heavens, bursting amid the incoming swarm. Japanese planes weaved through the fire, relentless, disciplined, pressing their attack. Marine fighters scrambled into the chaos. Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcats clawed upward, engines straining, their pilots hopelessly outmatched. Zeros swooped on them with predatory grace, turning inside their arcs, shredding them with bursts of machine gun fire. Within minutes, Midway's defenders were burning, tumbling into the sea, torn apart above their own base. Still they fought. One Buffalo rammed into a formation of Japanese bombers, scattering their attack. A Wildcat tore through smoke to cripple a dive bomber, only to be cut down moments later. For every American plane lost, seconds were bought, and every second mattered. Below, the island shook. Bombs slammed into fuel tanks, igniting infernos that rolled across the ground. Supply dumps exploded in chain reactions. The airfield became a graveyard of twisted wreckage and charred steel. Yet amid the destruction, Midway endured. Communications stayed alive. Some planes remained intact. The island did not fall. The Japanese pressed their attack with surgical brutality. Waves of bombers dived, pulled up, circled, and struck again. Fires raged out of control. The defenders bled and burned. Yet the garrison held its ground, refusing to break. Every gun, every rifle, every fighter in the sky was thrown into the storm. And though Midway burned, it did not surrender. High above, Japanese pilots reported their findings back to the fleet. The island was damaged but not destroyed. Another strike would be needed. Another wave of bombs. Another cycle of fire. That decision, routine, logical, almost inevitable, would set the stage for disaster. Because while the Japanese prepared their next strike on Midway, a shadow was already closing in from the northeast. The American carriers. The trap was still hidden, teeth ready, waiting for the perfect moment. The rising sun believed Midway was on the ropes. They did not know the real fight was only just beginning. Smoke hung over Midway like a shroud. The sky was torn apart by fire and steel, engines shrieking as planes twisted and fell. The defenders were outnumbered, outflown, and outgunned, but not out of the fight. On the ground, Marines manned their guns with blistered hands, sweat and sand stinging their eyes. The air shook with each explosion as anti-aircraft cannons hurled shells into the sky. Tracer fire clawed upward, stitching fiery lines through the air. When a Japanese bomber staggered, burst into flame, and spiraled into the sea, cheers cut through the chaos. But the cheers always ended too quickly, drowned by the next detonation. The first wave had mauled the airfield, ripping open craters in the runway, shredding hangars, igniting fuel stores. Fires roared unchecked, painting the horizon black. Still, mechanics dragged surviving aircraft into service, patching bullet holes with sheet metal, pouring fuel into leaking tanks, working under falling bombs as if time itself had been weaponized against them. In the air, the defense was desperate. Outclassed Brewster Buffaloes and Wildcats fought a hopeless battle against the deadly Zeros. Pilots climbed into the storm knowing their planes were slower, weaker, their chances slim. Yet they climbed anyway. They died in droves. Buffaloes burst into flame after brief exchanges. Wildcats spiraled down trailing smoke. Still, they charged tooth and claw, forcing the Japanese formations to scatter, to dodge, to waste precious seconds. Their sacrifice did not win the sky, but it blunted the killing edge of the enemy's blade. Bombers stationed on the island also launched, lumbering into the chaos with courage bordering on madness. B-26 Marauders and B-17 Flying Fortresses clawed their way aloft, heavy and slow, aiming at the enemy fleet far beyond the horizon. They were intercepted almost immediately, swarmed by Zeros, their formations shredded. Yet some broke through, diving toward Japanese carriers, releasing torpedoes that sliced through the waves. None struck true. Still, the message was clear. Midway would not bow without striking back. Casualties mounted. Pilots failed to return. Planes that landed came back riddled with holes, leaking oil, skidding across runways scarred with craters. Some crashed upon landing, their crews dragged from flaming wrecks by desperate hands. Commanders on Midway reported grimly, aircraft destroyed, defenses battered, men lost. And yet, with each message came the same phrase, still operational. Midway lived. The Japanese fleet received the reports. Their strike had inflicted heavy damage, but the island still breathed, its airfield still capable of launching sorties. A second wave would be required to finish the job. Bomb bays were reloaded, torpedoes refitted, planes refueled. On the carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, the decks bustled with activity. Crews rushed to prepare. And in that rush, amid the sweat, the noise, the urgency, Japan's fate began to unravel. Because while their planes were being rearmed for another strike on Midway, American carriers, hidden beyond the horizon, had launched their own. Wings lifted into the sky. Engines screamed into the wind. Bombs and torpedoes armed. Pilots set their jaws, adjusted their goggles, and pointed toward destiny. Midway was bleeding. But its sacrifice was not in vain. The defenders had bought time. Precious, irreplaceable time. And now the counterstroke was on its way. From the decks of the American carriers, the air was alive with thunder. Engines roared as squadrons launched into the morning sky. Fragile formations of torpedo bombers, slow and heavy, their bellies loaded with the weapons meant to sink giants. They were the devastators. Outdated. Obsolete. The TBD ones had been designed before the war, lumbering relics compared to the sleek Japanese Zeros. Their maximum speed was barely over 200 miles an hour, slower than the fighters that hunted them. Their armor was thin, their maneuverability poor. The men who flew them knew the truth. This was a near-suicidal mission. Yet still they went. From Hornet, Enterprise, and Yorktown, torpedo squadrons clawed into the sky, searching for the Japanese fleet. They flew low, skimming the waves, hoping the sea would shield them from sight. Radios crackled, compasses twitched, pilots squinted against the sun. They carried not just bombs, but the weight of vengeance, the memory of Pearl Harbor, the agony of Coral Sea, the screams from Midway's burning airfields. Soon the horizon revealed them, Yamamoto's carriers, sprawling across the ocean like floating fortresses. Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, Hiryu, each bristled with aircraft, their decks alive with crews rushing to prepare the next strike. The hunters had found their prey. But they were not unseen. Zeros rose to meet them, streaking down from the sky like falcons. The American formations held their line, slow, steady, wings tight. The first bursts of machine gun fire ripped through the air. A devastator shuddered, burst into flames, and cartwheeled into the sea. Then another. And another. Still, the torpedo squadrons pressed on. Hornet's Torpedo Squadron 8, led by Lieutenant Commander John Waldron, flew straight into the storm. Zeros slashed through their ranks, cutting them apart mercilessly. Plane after plane went down. Waldron himself was shot from the sky, his aircraft tumbling into the waves. Not one torpedo struck home. Out of 15 planes, not a single one returned. On Enterprise, Torpedo Squadron 6 fared no better. They too were torn apart. Their torpedoes dropped wildly as their formations collapsed under relentless fire. On Yorktown, Torpedo Squadron 3 joined the slaughter, pressing in through walls of tracers and explosions, only to be consumed. It was massacre. The devastators dropped their torpedoes at suicidal range, most running erratically, sinking harmlessly, or easily dodged by Japanese captains swinging their carriers hard to port. One by one, the American squadrons were annihilated. Smoke and fire littered the sea. But in that sacrifice lay salvation. The Japanese fighters, drawn down to sea level, were no longer circling high above. The carriers, forced into desperate evasive maneuvers, scattered their formations, and disrupted their deck operations. And in those moments of chaos, the trap shifted. Because high above, unseen and unchallenged, another wave was already descending, the dive bombers. The torpedo squadrons had not died in vain. They had cracked open the door. And through that door, vengeance was coming. The ocean below boiled with wreckage, burning aircraft, oil slicks, parachutes drifting like ghosts. The torpedo squadrons had flown into history, torn apart almost to the last man. Their sacrifice was complete, their names destined for legend. Yet their agony had carved a moment, a fleeting crack in Japan's armor. High above, more American planes clawed at the sky, dive bombers and fighters searching desperately for the enemy. Many had missed their rendezvous, scattered by fuel shortages, navigational errors, and the immensity of the Pacific. Squadrons split, commanders cursed the compass, and some pilots turned back with empty tanks. The trap itself seemed on the brink of unraveling. But fate has its moments. At 10:20 a.m., a formation of dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown stumbled upon the Japanese fleet almost by accident. They had been circling, low on fuel, nearly ready to abandon the search. Then, through a break in the clouds, black specks appeared on the water. Carriers. 4 of them, lined up like jewels on the sea. Below, the Japanese decks were chaos. Planes were being refueled, rearmed, bomb racks cluttered with live ordnance. The second strike against Midway was moments from launching. Fuel hoses snaked across planks, bombs lay stacked and waiting, men rushed to and fro with the urgency of victory assumed. It was the most vulnerable moment a carrier could ever know. The Americans dived. Dauntless peeled from the sky, their dive brakes whistling, the ocean tilting as they plunged. Pilots fixed their eyes on decks the size of postage stamps, their cockpits rattling, their bodies pressed by the crushing dive. Bullets stitched the air around them, flak blossomed like black flowers, but they held steady. Then release. Bombs screamed downward, trailing smoke, spinning into fate. The first hit slammed into Kaga, ripping her decks apart, igniting torpedoes and fuel lines. A heartbeat later, more bombs tore into her hull. Explosions thundered upward, engulfing the ship in fire. Her crew fought desperately, but the inferno consumed her. Akagi, the flagship, took a bomb square on her flight deck. Flames tore through fuel lines, engulfing the bridge, racing uncontrollably. Admiral Nagumo, stunned, barely escaped with his staff as his pride burned beneath him. Soryu was next, 3 bombs plunging deep, detonating below decks. Within minutes, she too was an inferno, men leaping into the sea to escape the firestorm. 3 carriers. 3 giants of the Imperial Navy, burning within 6 minutes. The impossible had happened. Above the carnage, American pilots pulled away, their hearts hammering, their fuel tanks nearly empty. Behind them, towering columns of smoke marked the turning of the tide. The sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons had dragged the Zeros down low, had forced evasive maneuvers, had left the decks exposed. And the dive bombers had struck with perfect, devastating timing. But the battle was not yet over. 1 Japanese carrier remained, Hiryu. Untouched, vengeful, ready to fight back. The ocean was littered with fire and wreckage. But the sky still had teeth. The Pacific boiled with smoke. Columns of black fire rose from 3 Japanese carriers, their decks shattered, their crews screaming amid chaos. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Imperial Navy bled. Yet the victory had not been inevitable. It had come from a sliver of time, a window so narrow, so fragile, it seemed as if chance itself had reached down to tilt the scales. The dive bombers had arrived at the precise instant when fortune and fire aligned. Minutes earlier, the Japanese carriers had been poised to launch their second strike against Midway. Their decks were crowded with aircraft armed and fueled, bombs stacked like cordwood, hoses pumping gasoline. A spark in such conditions was death waiting for a hand to strike the match. And the hand came from above. Had the dauntless squadrons arrived 5 minutes sooner, the decks might have been clear. 5 minutes later, the Japanese planes would have been airborne, swarming the Americans with overwhelming force. But at that exact heartbeat, the carriers were naked, vulnerable, their greatest strength transformed into their greatest weakness. Luck, fate, or the hard-earned result of sacrifice. Historians would argue forever. The torpedo squadrons had paid the price of blood, dragging the Zeros down, scattering Japanese formations. The dive bombers, guided by fragments of chance and stubborn persistence, had found their prey at the perfect moment. And in 6 minutes, the unshakable aura of the Japanese Navy was shattered. Aboard Kaga, explosions ripped through her decks, detonating bombs stored below. Flames shot skyward, engulfing planes still waiting to launch. Crews fought desperately with hoses and buckets, but the inferno was unstoppable. One by one, her magazines erupted, turning the proud carrier into a floating pyre. Akagi, the flagship, staggered as fire consumed her bridge. Admiral Nagumo abandoned ship, stunned, his plans dissolving in smoke. His carefully crafted deception, his dream of crushing the U.S. fleet, was undone in minutes. Soryu groaned as her hull split under the fury of detonations. Below decks, trapped men pounded on sealed hatches, their cries drowned by fire. Above, others leapt into the waves, the sea filling with survivors and corpses alike. For the Japanese, it was unthinkable. Their invincible carriers, destroyers of fleets, terror of the Pacific, lay crippled and dying. The rising sun, once unstoppable, flickered amid smoke and ruin. Yet even as 3 carriers burned, one remained. Hiryu, the lone survivor. Her decks intact, her crews unbroken, her pilots seething with vengeance. From her hangars, fighters and bombers rolled onto the deck, engines screaming for retribution. The Japanese still had a blade to wield, and they would strike it with fury. The Americans, too, knew the danger. Their squadrons were scattered, their carriers exposed. The tide had turned, but tides can shift again. For a brief moment, the ocean seemed to hold its breath. 3 giants lay dying, one remained, and the fate of the battle, perhaps the war, hung in the balance. The window of fate had opened once. Would it open again? The sea was a graveyard of giants. Black smoke coiled upward in monstrous pillars, visible for miles across the Pacific. Beneath those clouds, the Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu burned like funeral pyres. On Kaga, the flames spread faster than men could fight them. The bomb that tore into her deck had set off a chain reaction. Fuel lines ruptured, torpedoes cooked off, magazines exploded with bone-shaking thunder. Sailors rushed with hoses and sand, but the inferno consumed everything it touched. Survivors scrambled into the sea, the water itself igniting as oil slicks burned atop the waves. The proud carrier that had once led Pearl Harbor's strike was finished. The flagship, Akagi, was no better. A single bomb, just one, had struck her with surgical cruelty. It crashed through the deck, igniting fuel and bombs below. In minutes, the ship was crippled, her command bridge a furnace, her officers staggering through choking smoke. Admiral Nagumo abandoned her reluctantly, the rising sun flag carried away by escorting destroyers. The symbol of Japan's naval might was reduced to a drifting wreck. Soryu, too, was gutted. 3 bombs had plunged into her heart, detonating in hangars packed with aircraft. The blasts rolled through her decks like thunder in a cavern, turning steel into splinters. Her crew fought heroically, but the firestorms gave no quarter. Men leapt into the sea, some aflame, some clinging to wreckage as their home vanished in pillars of smoke. In less than 10 minutes, half the striking power of the Imperial Navy had been obliterated. The invincible myth of Japanese dominance was unraveling before their eyes. And yet, amid the carnage, the survivors refused to yield. From Hiryu, the lone carrier still unscathed, a counterattack was already forming. Her decks bustled with activity. Crews refueling, pilots strapping into cockpits, bombs hoisted into racks. Their orders were simple, their mission clear: avenge their fallen sisters. Strike the Americans before they could press their advantage. To the Japanese sailors watching their world burn, Hiryu became a symbol. She was their last blade, sharp and unbroken, the only chance to salvage honor from catastrophe. For the Americans, The moment was intoxicating but perilous. The impossible had been achieved. 3 carriers sunk in a single stroke. Sailors aboard Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown cheered. Some openly wept. Others gripped their rifles with trembling hands, scarcely believing what they had witnessed. The ghosts of Pearl Harbor seemed avenged in fire. But jubilation was fleeting. Reports crackled across radios. Enemy planes still inbound. Hiryu was alive, and she was hunting. The battle was not finished. The ocean was still a battlefield, and the next blow could fall either way. Smoke curled, decks burned, men drowned. The Pacific groaned under the weight of history, and Hiryu prepared to strike. Smoke still clung to the horizon where Akagi, Kaga, and Soria burned, but far to the north, Hiryu stood defiant, her decks intact, her air groups ready. She was the last sword in Yamamoto's hand, and she would not be sheathed quietly. Admiral Taman Yamaguchi, commanding Hiryu, refused despair. Where others might have seen ruin, he saw duty. His carriers lay crippled, but his spirit remained unbroken. He ordered immediate retaliation. Crews swarmed the deck, loading torpedoes, arming bombs, refueling fighters. Pilots tightened their goggles, faces set like stone. They knew the odds. They knew the enemy had struck a devastating blow. But still, they climbed into their cockpits. Engines roared. Wings lifted. The counterblow began. The first wave of Japanese bombers streaked across the sea, guided by scouts who had finally located the American task force. Their target, the battered carrier Yorktown. She had already suffered grievous damage at Coral Sea, her scars hidden beneath hurried repairs. Now she faced the wrath of Hiryu. At 2:20 p.m., the enemy descended. Bombers peeled into their dives, sirens shrieking, machine guns blazing. Yorktown's anti-aircraft batteries opened fire, tracers filling the sky with walls of steel. Smoke puffed and blossomed around the attackers, but they pressed on with deadly precision. The first bomb hit amidships, tearing through her decks, detonating deep inside. Fire erupted instantly, rolling through compartments, choking men with heat and smoke. A second bomb followed, smashing into her bow, ripping steel like paper. The deck buckled, flames roaring skyward. Crews fought desperately with hoses, sealing bulkheads, dragging the wounded clear. Still, Yorktown fought to live. Her crew was disciplined, relentless, veterans hardened by Pearl Harbor and Coral Sea. Firefighters doused flames, damage control teams patched ruptures, engines coughed back to life. For a moment, it seemed she might survive, her resilience defying fate itself. But fate was not finished. Even as Yorktown's men battled flames, Hiryu launched her second strike. Torpedo planes swept low across the waves, Zero escorts snarling overhead. The Americans threw everything into defense. Fighters scrambled, guns thundered, but the Japanese pressed in. 2 torpedoes found their mark. They slammed into Yorktown's side, exploding with monstrous force. The carrier shuddered, her hull splitting, power failing. Water flooded compartments. She began to list, her proud decks tilting toward the sea. Still, her crew would not abandon her. Pumps roared, counterflooding began. Fires were beaten back again. For hours, Yorktown clung to life, her sailors fighting as fiercely as any pilot in the skies. But the cost was immense. Hundreds lay dead or wounded. The carrier was crippled, her fate uncertain. From Hiryu's decks, cheers erupted as reports came in. The Americans had been struck. The counterblow had landed. In the eyes of the Japanese, honor had been salvaged. For a moment, it seemed the rising sun still held a blade. Yet Yamaguchi knew the truth. One carrier could not stand against 3. His blow had been sharp, but it had not been fatal. The Americans still had strength. They still had dive bombers circling high, hungry for vengeance. The ocean burned with wreckage. The sky groaned with smoke. The battle hung by a thread. And soon, the hunter would become the hunted once more. The Yorktown was dying, yet she refused to sink. Smoke poured from her wounds, flames clawed at her decks, and seawater rushed into her torn hull. She listed badly, her great frame groaning under the strain. But her crew fought like men possessed, turning the carrier itself into a battlefield where every bulkhead, every pump, every hose became a weapon against death. The first Japanese strike had gutted her. The second had nearly finished the job. Bombs had smashed her flight deck, torpedoes had punched through her flanks. Yet still, hoses hissed, compartments were sealed, fires were beaten back. Sailors hauled the wounded from wreckage, dragged hoses through smoke-choked corridors, welded steel patches over gaping wounds. By late afternoon, against all expectation, Yorktown was steadying. Her engines were alive again. Her list corrected. Her pumps keeping pace with the flooding. To the men aboard, it felt like a miracle. The carrier they called the Fighting Lady had survived Coral Sea. Now she seemed unkillable. But the Pacific was merciless. At 3:30 p.m., American scouts spotted Hiryu. She had revealed herself by launching her strikes. Now her position was known. Admiral Spruance wasted no time. Dive bombers from Enterprise and Hornet were ordered in. The noose was tightening. Even as Yorktown's crew battled to keep her alive, her sister ships prepared to avenge her. Meanwhile, from Hiryu, Japanese crews scrambled to ready yet another strike. Pilots climbed back into cockpits, exhausted but determined. Their carrier was the last hope of the Empire's fleet that day. They would fight until nothing remained. But they were too late. The American dive bombers arrived with the suddenness of a hammer blow. At 5 p.m., dauntless peeled from the sky, their dive brakes shrieking. Below, Hiryu's decks were cluttered with fueled aircraft, bombs stacked and waiting. The same fatal vulnerability that had doomed her sisters hours before. Bombs slammed into her flight deck. One, then two, then more. Explosions ripped through her hangars, igniting planes, detonating munitions. Flames surged skyward, black smoke twisting into the heavens. Hiryu staggered, shuddered, and then began to burn uncontrollably. On Yorktown, sailors cheered when the word spread. Their tormentor was afire. The last Japanese carrier was finished. The rising sun's blade had been broken. But their own ordeal was not over. Though Yorktown had survived the air attacks, she was crippled, limping, a wounded giant in hostile waters. Tugs moved to take her in tow, crews clung to hope that she might yet be saved. That hope would soon be tested again. Japanese submarines still prowled the depths. And one of them, silent and unseen, was already stalking the battered carrier. The Pacific was not finished with her. Not yet. By nightfall on June 4th, the Pacific had become a cemetery. The once proud carriers Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and now Hiryu lay broken, burning, or sinking beneath the waves. The sea was littered with debris, charred lifeboats, splintered planks, oil slicks stretching for miles. Survivors clung to the wreckage, their uniforms blackened, their faces streaked with salt and smoke. The ocean, vast and eternal, was now heavy with human voices. Cries for help, prayers whispered in the dark, shouts muffled by the crash of waves. For many, rescue would never come. Japanese destroyers scoured the waters, pulling up the lucky, leaving others to the sea. Sharks circled in the bloody foam. Silence swallowed the rest. American pilots flew above the graveyard, their cockpits reeking of cordite and sweat. Some looked down at the inferno below in disbelief. In a single day, they had crippled the strongest naval force on Earth. But the cost was written in their own ranks, squadrons decimated, comrades vanished, empty chairs waiting back at the carriers. The victory was real, but it was soaked in blood. On the surviving Japanese ships, despair mingled with discipline. Officers issued orders with iron composure, but sailors wept quietly in corners. No battle in their empire's history had ever unraveled so swiftly, so completely. For carriers lost in a single afternoon, it was a catastrophe beyond imagining. And yet, the battle was not entirely over. The American carriers had dealt their blow, but they too were wounded. The Yorktown, gutted by bombs and torpedoes, drifted stubbornly, her crew still fighting to save her. By dawn on June 5th, destroyers and cruisers circled protectively, while salvage teams labored to keep her afloat. Pumps throbbed against the flooding. Power flickered, held, then faltered again. Men fought exhaustion, their uniforms soaked in oil and sweat. For a moment, it seemed possible. Perhaps Yorktown could be towed home, patched again, and returned to fight. She had survived Coral Sea. She had endured the worst Japan could throw at her. Surely she could live once more. But the ocean kept its secrets. Beneath the waves, silent hunters prowled, submarines of the Imperial Navy, still waiting to strike. One of them, the I-168, crept toward the American fleet. Her periscope scanned the horizon. Her captain saw the crippled carrier, heavy with wounds, surrounded by escorts. A target too tempting to ignore. The ocean was filled with wreckage, but one more ship would soon join it. The sea had taken Japan's giants. Now it reached for America's wounded. The night air over the Pacific was thick with smoke and silence. What hours earlier had been the proud spearhead of Japan's naval power was now a broken shadow drifting on the sea. The Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, 4 carriers that had terrorized the Pacific since Pearl Harbor, were gone. Their hulks burned or sank, their crews scattered, their air wings obliterated. It was more than defeat. It was disaster. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commanding from miles away aboard his flagship Yamato, received the reports in stunned disbelief. His grand plan, the decisive blow that was to end America's will to fight, had unraveled in a single day. For carriers, thousands of irreplaceable pilots, and the aura of invincibility that cloaked the Imperial Navy, all consumed in fire. The shattered armada limped westward. Battleships and cruisers turned home, their decks crowded with survivors rescued from the oil-stained waters. Destroyers towed lifeboats filled with burned, broken men. The rising sun flags still fluttered, but their brilliance seemed pale, diminished, smudged by smoke and grief. Among the survivors, morale collapsed. Sailors wept openly for comrades lost. Veteran pilots, once confident of empire without end, sat in silence, their eyes hollow. For the first time since the war began, doubt took root in Japanese hearts. Could they truly prevail against the giant they had awakened? And yet, Yamamoto would not admit final defeat. His battleships still prowled, his submarines lurked unseen, and he ordered his fleet to remain at sea, searching for an opening to strike back. The Americans had bloodied him, but he believed there might still be time to salvage honor. That hope flickered briefly on June 6th, when submarine I-168 slipped past American destroyers and unleashed her attack on the wounded Yorktown. Torpedoes tore into the already crippled carrier, sending her listing heavily to port. Hours later, she rolled and sank beneath the waves, joining the graveyard of steel below. The loss of Yorktown stung, but it was nothing compared to the blow Japan had suffered. For carriers to one, hundreds of irreplaceable planes. The cream of their naval aviators lost in a single battle. Midway had not merely evened the odds, it had reversed them. When Yamamoto finally gave the order to withdraw, his words carried the weight of an empire changed forever. Japan would never again seize the initiative in the Pacific. The dream of forcing America to its knees had perished with the carriers. For the Americans, the sight of smoldering wrecks and fleeing fleets was more than a battlefield victory. It was redemption. Pearl Harbor's ghosts seemed answered, their cries stilled in the thunder of American bombs. The giant had risen. The armada that had once ruled the Pacific was shattered. And the war had turned. The smoke of Midway drifted for days, staining the sky and the sea. Oil slicks spread across the water like black scars. Lifeboats bobbed in the swells, carrying the exhausted, the burned, the broken. Beneath the waves, the wrecks of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu sank slowly into silence, steel tombs entombing thousands. News traveled quickly. Within hours, signals flashed across the Pacific. The impossible had happened. 4 Japanese carriers, destroyers of Pearl Harbor, engines of conquest, were gone. In Washington, the War Department erupted in relief. For the first time since December 7, 1941, the headlines carried triumph instead of tragedy. In Britain, Churchill called it an extraordinary and fortunate event. In Tokyo, the government released muted statements, hiding the scale of the disaster. But whispers spread. Families asked questions. The myth of invincibility had cracked. For the Americans, Midway was more than victory, it was vindication. 6 months earlier, they had been humbled, humiliated, struck to the core at Pearl Harbor. Factories had scrambled to rebuild. Sailors had trained in haste. Pilots had climbed into outdated planes, untested, uncertain. And yet, against all odds, they had turned the tide. On the decks of Enterprise and Hornet, sailors celebrated with weary smiles, their faces smeared with oil and sweat. Many had lost comrades, squadrons, even entire units. The price was steep, but the reward was hope. No longer were they merely surviving the Pacific War, they were winning it. For Japan, the echoes were darker. The loss of 4 fleet carriers and the cream of their naval aviators was a wound that could never be healed. Their shipyards could replace hulls, but not the men who had died. Pilots who had trained for years, veterans forged in campaigns from China to Pearl Harbor. Each lost crewman was experience gone forever. Each sunken carrier was time Japan could not afford. And in those echoes lay a truth Yamamoto himself had feared. The sleeping giant had awakened. America's factories were already roaring, building ships faster than they could be sunk, training pilots faster than they could fall. The imbalance that Midway revealed would only grow. Still, in the summer of 1942, no one knew how long the road would be. Guadalcanal waited. Tarawa, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. Years of blood and sacrifice still loomed. Midway had not ended the war, but it had changed its direction forever. The Pacific was no longer Japan's ocean. It belonged to the struggle now, to 2 nations locked in combat, to thousands of men who would never see home again. And across the waves, the echoes of Midway carried a single truth. The tide had turned. The Pacific was never the same after Midway. Before June 1942, Japan had seemed unstoppable. Its banners flew from Burma to the Solomons, its fleets roamed freely, its pilots struck terror wherever their shadows fell. But in just 3 days, the myth of Japanese invincibility was burned away in towering columns of smoke. The United States had lost 1 carrier, but Japan had lost 4. More devastating still, they had lost their best aviators, the hardened veterans who had carved an empire from the Pacific sky. Replacements would come, but they would be green, untested, forced to face an enemy growing stronger every day. From the ashes of Pearl Harbor had risen a new America, bloodied, yes, but sharper, harder, and now confident. Factories thundered, launching a new carrier every few months, cranking out fighters, bombers, submarines, tanks. Men enlisted by the millions, answering the call with a resolve forged in the flames of December 7th. For Japan, Midway was the moment the future dimmed. The empire would fight on, ferociously, desperately, with courage that shook the world. But the initiative was gone. Never again would they strike first on such a scale. Never again would the rising sun dominate the seas unchallenged. Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor, understood it better than most. His warning had come true. In awakening America, he had sealed his nation's fate. Midway did not end the Pacific War. Battles still raged ahead: Guadalcanal, Leyte Gulf, the Marianas, Okinawa. Countless men would fall before final victory. But Midway was the hinge of destiny. It was the moment the tide turned, the moment hope shifted sides, the moment when the hunter became the hunted. The ocean still carries their echoes. The shattered squadrons. The torpedo pilots who flew into certain death. The dive bombers who plunged through fire. The sailors who fought flames aboard sinking decks. Their courage hangs over the Pacific, eternal, unbroken. Midway was not just a battle. It was a rebirth. The war was far from over. But from this point on, the world knew how it would end.